Last time we spoke, Emperor Xianfeng died at the ripe age of 30, having spent a life smoking opium with his harem. Now the Qing Dynasty was in the hands of his 5-year-old son. But in reality, henceforth until its collapse, the Qing Dynasty would actually be controlled by the infamous Empress Dowager Cixi. Hong Xiuquan received a military defeat at Tongcheng, and it seems he would never psychologically recover from it. Li Xiuquan went on the offensive and performed a grand eastern campaign, taking multiple provinces. Zhang Guofan needed a new army created, and he chose his student, Li Hongjiang, to command it. The Anhui army was formed, and it looked like the Qing dynasty's side was going to win this civil war after all. The only thing that might turn the tide back for the Taiping was the ever sought after foreign support. This episode is the Taiping Rebellion Part 10, The Ever Victorious Army. Welcome back to the Fall and Rise of China podcast, and I'm your dutiful host, Craig Watson. But before we can begin, I just want to remind you all that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Perhaps you want to learn a bit more about the history of Asia? Kings and Generals has an assortment on episodes on the history of Asia and much, much more, so go give them a look over at YouTube. So please, subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube and continue to help us produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And hey, don't forget about our sister podcast over at the Pacific War Week by Week podcast, written and narrated by me. And if after all that you were still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel over at YouTube, where I'm just now finishing up a multi-part series on China's warlord era. Also, just a friendly reminder, I myself now have a Patreon account, which can be found at www.patreon.com/thepacificwarchannel. Over there, you can get all the standard goodies like early access, live hangouts, voting on new subjects, and such. But most importantly, I am creating exclusive content just for you based off of your interests. So perhaps it's something I can't cover on this podcast or on other projects I'm associated with. Check it out. It means a lot to me. Back in Nanjing, Hong Xiuquan's life was becoming more and more miserable. He had lost Anqing, and his rivals used his absence to take away his authority in the capital. His continued efforts at gaining Western support was going nowhere. In fact, it was earning him embarrassment. The foreign relations to the Taiping had become poisoned, due to a large part because of the Eastern campaign led by Li Xiuquan. Many of the foreign missionaries stopped visiting Nanjing, and soon that direct line of communication that Hong Xiuquan cherished had slipped away. Shanghai was bracing itself for what it believed was a Taiping offensive against the city, and Hong Xiuquan could do little to nothing to stop Li Xiuquan. As for Zhang Guofan, he knew that Shanghai was extremely wealthy and must be protected from the Taiping, but Nanjing was simply more important, and he could not launch two enormous campaigns simultaneously. Zhang Guofan elected to focus on Nanjing, and perhaps once Li Hongjiang had built up his Anhui army, maybe he could deal with the Shanghai situation. For Shanghai, it looked certain that the Taiping would attack soon, and the Qing had no assurances from the foreigners that they would help defend the city. They had no one to turn to. No one, that is, except for our old friend, the filibuster wannabe, Frederick Townsend Ward. Despite Britain's attempts to stop the mercenary leader, he was still going strong with his HQ at Songjiang. He only had 68 foreign mercenaries left because of the constant harassment from the Taiping and the British, but he did have some Napoleon field guns, and a promise from his Qing benefactors that if he took Qingpu, he would be rewarded handsomely. Way back when we talked about how Ward's ragtag group failed to take Qingpu from the Taiping, they'd attempted 4 more times with disastrous results. They just kept using the same strategy over and over. Blast the gates with artillery, storm the walls, and hope the Qing military followed through. Ward's defeats were brutal, and he lost a third of his forces for his efforts. The foreign community of Shanghai had zero sympathy for the filibuster. He was just kind of a source of embarrassment. But then the American Civil War broke out, and a rumor emerged about a group of Californians purchasing the vessel, the Neva, and that it was a Confederate ship now being run by none other than Ward. According to these rumors, the Neva was outfitted with guns stolen from the U.S. munitions stored in Shanghai, and this said vessel was firing upon Union merchant ships going around the Chinese coast. The United States only had a single warship in China at the time, the USS Saginaw, which was hunting the so-called Neva. When they finally caught up to the Neva, the so-called guns it held were actually whiskey. It was just another merchant ship. But still, the rumors persisted, raising Ward as this legendary figure. Now, this was all quite awkward as hell in Shanghai. The American population was overwhelmingly pro-Union Northerners, while the British were more pro-Confederacy. The American merchants were dependent on the British warships to protect their business, and this caused all sorts of conflict. During one particularly bad incident, the Trent Incident of 1862, in which a U.S. captain chased down and boarded the British steamer Trent, trying to arrest two Confederate diplomats. If you know the story, well, you know the story, it's a funny one. Anyways, long story short, it was the Confederates trying to go to Britain to make their case, and the Union illegally arrested them. Yes, we'll say that. They illegally arrested them. Anyways, this led Admiral Hope to get his naval forces at Shanghai to seize the homes, vessels, and assets of the American community. This also led to a rumor that Ward was going to preemptively attack Hope's force. The entire American community in Shanghai thought that they might go to war with Britain yet again, but this never came to be. Meanwhile, during all of the chaos, the very real threat, the Taiping, began to appear on the horizon of Shanghai on January the 11th. The alarms all sounded when smoke began to emerge just due north of the city, and a new wave of refugees began pouring in. The smoke began to get closer and closer, prompting the foreign community to hold emergency meetings to plan for a defense. The Americans, British, and French put aside their quarrels, and they banded together to man the walls. The threat was extremely real. One member of the community had been captured and interrogated by the Taiping about the city's defenses, and this man reported that he saw the rebels were carrying British and German muskets, and that there appeared to be an Arab military advisor and a small group of European mercenaries amongst their ranks. Then a force of around 3,000 Taiping branding muskets seized the town of Wusang, just 10 miles north of the city. One British captain reported witnessing the battle, and he said the Taiping were quite astonishing, very well organized, and quite well equipped, far better than the Qing seemed to be at the Battle of Peiho. Li Xiuquan did not want to smash Shanghai into pieces. He wanted to do everything possible to take it mostly intact. Thus, his strategy was to surround the city and bring her to her knees. Beginning in January, 5 Taiping armies, each numbering in tens of thousands, began surrounding Shanghai at a distance of several miles each. Soon, a propaganda campaign emerged between Songjiang and Shanghai, with written notes stating that the Taiping would ensure the safety and protection of all those who joined their side. As for the foreign community, Li Xiuquan warned them to stay out of the conflict, and that anyone caught giving aid to the Qing would, quote, "will be like a flying moth dashing into the fire, seeking his own extirpation." Thus, Shanghai was under siege, and the communications to inland places were severed. Admiral Hope sent word to Hong Kong asking for reinforcements, and the consul of Canton relayed the dire news back to Britain. The new wave of refugees brought far too many mouths to the city. 80,000 or so Taiping surrounded Shanghai, and the word was that more were coming from Suzhou by the end of the month. The main defensive body for the foreign community were British and French troops who manned the walls, alongside 200 volunteers, some police, and a contingent of Punjabi infantry. In an unusual fashion, on January the 26th, snow began to fall. Now, do remember, Shanghai lays in a subtropical zone, rarely seeing temperatures below freezing. By the time the Taiping began to fully encircle Shanghai, there was about 2 feet of snow in the area, and this had a paralyzing effect in the lower Yangtze region. By the end of January, the eastern seaboard froze. The weather would break in early February, but the Taiping were delayed greatly by all of this. The Taiping found an unexpected resistance at Songjiang, Ward's force. Now, after losing so many battles, Ward had stopped simply recruiting Westerners, so he now began training Chinese instead. He had a minimal staff of American and European officers overseeing the training of his Chinese forces, and because of the payment differences, the Chinese, after all, were paid just a tenth of what the Westerners were paid, well, this led him to have a pretty large force under him now. Ward taught his Chinese soldiers how to respond to English commands and the standard bugle calls. The men were outfitted with European-style uniforms, typically blue jackets for artillerymen, green jackets for infantry. They were trained in the Western fashion and equipped with cutting-edge weaponry, British Enfield rifles, some Prussian-made rifles, and the odd American rifle or pistol here or there. But the Taiping were also getting their hands on some Western weaponry. One report in 1862 showed a ship was caught smuggling 300 cannons, 100 cases of small arms, and 50 tons of ammunition to the Taiping from Singapore. Another report indicated the Taiping at Wusang had been supplied with nearly 3,000 muskets, 800 pieces of artillery, and 18,000 cartridges. A dangerous amount, to be sure. On February the 3rd, Ward's new militia fought the Taiping, managing to hold out at Songjiang against a force of over 20,000 rebels. Their success was largely due to hidden artillery batteries they had placed outside the town, which surprised the rebels during their approach, gunning down over 2,000 men before their commander could call for retreat. Ward's men managed to capture 700 Taiping alive, and they shipped them right back to Shanghai in chains. 2 days after the battle, Ward went on the offensive, attacking a Taiping outpost halfway between Songjiang and Qingpu, forcing the garrison commander to pull out. This was the first time the Shanghai gentry-funded private army had any real success, and this prompted them to rename the force to give it some more inspiration. And thus, the Ward militia became known as the famous Ever Victorious Army, EVA. Many of you may have heard of this force, if you are American. It's probably one of the very few things known about the Taiping Rebellion in the West, to be honest. The EVA force took orders from Wu Xu, the main benefactor, who by no means trusted General Ward. Ward and his Westerners continuously plundered wherever they went, despite Wu Xu pleading for them not to do so. In order to try and secure some form of loyalty from Ward, one of the wealthiest backers, the banker Yang Fang, married his daughter off to Ward. The Chinese woman had been betrothed to another, but the man died before the wedding, making her unmarriable within the Chinese culture. It was a mutual arrangement. For Ward, he could pressure his wife to push the backers to pay up, and for the backers, they could pressure Ward to remain loyal. Now, after the snowstorm dissipated, and I refer to it as being a snowstorm simply because my sources do, but as a Canadian, if you think 2 feet of snow is a storm, then wow, oh my god, you have no idea what you're talking about. Anyways, Admiral Hope and Rear Admiral Auguste Leopold Protet signed a joint agreement on February the 13th to defend Shanghai from the Taiping based on Hope's 30-mile radius idea. They formed a land force to take out into the field against the Taiping. Although the British Parliament had made it absolutely clear to Hope he was not to break neutrality, unless it was to save the lives of British subjects. Hope, as you can imagine, disregarded those orders. Their force was not very large, 900 French and 650 British soldiers, some sailors, and a reserve of 200 civilian volunteers, including Americans. The Qing forces in Shanghai were around 10,000 strong. Hope had, no hope to match the Taiping out in the field. but he believed he could hold the walls. If he wanted to perform any action out in the field, he simply needed more men. And take a while to guess who he might go to. Oh yes, the man he tried to arrest on countless occasions, the filibuster Ward. Since Ward now was recruiting Chinese rather than trying to steal away Westerners, and given his recent military victories, Admiral Hope decided to form an alliance with Ward. Ward had zero interest in the defense of Shanghai, but Hope enticed him with gunships that he could move his men to hit Taiping towns along the riverways. Frederick Bruce approved the alliance of convenience, but stressed while they could perhaps drive the Taiping out of the immediate area, they had to allow the Qing forces to actually push further and to garrison towns taken. Zheng Guofan, upon hearing of all of this, disapproved, and he did not think it would prove very fruitful. But he had no large cards to play in the east, and if the Ava held Shanghai, well, that would be dandy. And when Ward's men won the battle for Songjiang on February the 20th, Zheng Guofan begrudgingly sent word to Beijing that it was in the dynasty's best interest to allow the bizarre foreign mercenary force to continue its work in Shanghai and even Ningbo if they could get there. But he also strongly warned them not to let the Ava forces campaign further inland, especially not against Nanjing. If foreigners were to help defeat Nanjing, well, they might demand big rewards for such deeds. Now, given the Ava would be augmenting the Shanghai area, now Zheng Guofan felt perhaps he could dedicate some forces there as well. After all, if he could grab Shanghai, it would be an enormous boost to his own power. He approached the gentry of Shanghai, and they found common ground. They sought further protection, and Zheng Guofan sought further funding for his campaign against Nanjing. Thus, Zheng Guofan tossed an army to try and break the siege of Shanghai. If they were successful, that said army could later be used to cut off Nanjing. Another enormous benefit from this arrangement was Zheng Guofan obtaining what Hong Xiuquan so desperately desired. The Shanghai backers, nominally Wu Xu, formed a contract with a British firm, Mackenzie Richardson's and Company, to use their steamships. Now Zheng Guofan could move his forces unimpeded downriver to Shanghai aboard British steamers. The Taiping could not fire upon the ships because of the Union Jack, and in just 3 round trips, 6,500 of Li Hangjiang's new Anhui forces were encamped in Shanghai, ready for campaigning. Li Hangjiang then assumed his role as governor of the province and by proxy became the leader of the Shanghai backers, while Wu Xu would retain control over the Ava force. Meanwhile, with Shanghai now under Li Hangjiang's oversight, Zheng Guofan and both his brothers, Zheng Guoquan and Guobao, began to march towards Nanjing. Shanghai was under siege, albeit from quite a distance. Still, it had an enormous effect on its economy, its very lifeblood. The price of rice went up by 50%. Flour and firewood doubled. But the Taiping were not attacking the walls. Not yet, at least. Joint operations between the Ava and the foreign defenders began on a small scale in mid-February, with an assault upon Hai Bridge, 8 miles away from Shanghai proper. Ward had 600 men, while Hope and Protet brought 500. The battle was a quick one, with only a single Frenchman killed, if it's to be believed, before the Taiping fled the town. Then on April the 23rd, a rather fateful action occurred at Ningbo. A Taiping commander received a promotion, now General Fan, and in his honor they fired a 10 a.m. salute from the cannons facing the river. The guns apparently were not very well aimed, and a handful of projectiles went across the river and hit the French gunship L'Étoile as it was passing by. Admiral Hope and Protet used the situation to dispatch their forces led by Captain Roderick Dhu aboard the encounter, who retaliated against Ningbo. However, when Dhu got to Ningbo, the Taiping profusely apologized and stated that they wanted to remain under friendly terms and would make sure it never happened again. Hope and Protet were not at all content with this, and they sent word to demand the Taiping take down all the guns on the eastward-facing wall of Ningbo. They were given just 24 hours to comply, or else the British would do it themselves. Well, the Taiping refused to comply because they obviously needed said cannons where they were to defend against the Qing, but they did offer to take away the gunpowder from said cannons and to only provide it back if the Qing attacked. Then on May the 5th, a large group led by the disposed Ningbo gentry got together a group of about 150 small armed boats led by some pirates and peasants to come up the river to attack Ningbo, and as they did so, they asked the British and French for assistance. As my sources put it, just as a mere coincidence, their point of attack was on the same eastern wall. Thus, the British and French invited the motley group to their side of the river. Then Captain Du sent word to the Taiping. If you fire the guns or muskets from the battery or walls opposite of the settlement on the advancing imperialists, thereby endangering the lives of our men and people in the foreign settlement, we shall then feel it is our duty to return fire and bombard the city. So just to summarize, this motley crew of pirates are going to attack the eastern wall of Ningbo, and they just so happen to be right beside the British and French. So if the Taiping decide they're going to retaliate, which they should, they're being attacked, they risk shooting at the British and French. And now they're saying they'll simply attack them back if they do so. It would turn out that this was a very well-planned scheme between the Qing and the British and French. The motley group began approaching Ningbo, but then positioned themselves in such a way as to push the European gunships between them and the city. Accounts differ. The Europeans state one of the Taiping cannons fired upon the encounter, killing 2 crewmen. Another account states that that person who fired that cannon was actually a servant of one of the Shanghai gentry backers. Regardless, the British and French ships began to bombard Ningbo before the combined Ally party stormed the eastern wall. The motley group were actually the last to storm the city in the end, leaving most of the bloody work to the Europeans. And according to eyewitness accounts, in just a few hours, they did more damage than the rebels did in the whole of 5 months. And they chopped off the heads of any unlucky rebel that they caught. The British press went right to work demonizing the Taiping, a lot of which was based on witness accounts from specific men responsible for trying to break the neutrality stance of Britain. There was also a need to create a narrative to control China in general. Britain had turned its attention squarely to Asia since the American Civil War had broken so much of their trade. The Times declared, "The only route to Great Britain's economic survival lay down the path of the Taiping's annihilation." The Times carried on, stating that the tea market was being ruined allegedly by the Taiping, and to compensate, Britain would have to raise the tax rate on tea to preserve revenue. This would bring hardship to the tea-drinking working class of Britain who were already suffering from textile depression. Thus, the stance of neutrality was hurting the good people of Britain. Boy, oh boy, do you see the parallels in today's politics. The warmongers won the day, and Britain's government's hands were tied. Thus, Britain was dragged into a proxy war with the Taiping. The European coalition, Ava, the Qing, and Li Hangzhang's Anhui army were now allied, and they were going to embark on a large campaign to push the Taiping out of the Shanghai region. The beginnings of the campaign were largely successful as a result of their superior firearms. By May the 16th, a combined force left Shanghai and Songjiang, and they marched upon Qingpu. They bombarded the town for 2 hours using 40 artillery pieces, including a 68-pounder and 4 giant 110-pound naval Armstrong guns. Its gates were blown to splinters, and 3,500 of Ward's Chinese Ava troops stormed the town as God Save the Queen was blasted by the military band. 4 days later, Admiral Protet led an assault upon the South Bridge, which lay just due south of Songjiang, and was shot right through the heart by a Taiping sniper. His death enraged the French, who took out their vengeance upon the nearby town of Julin, where they massacred 3,000 civilians, including women and children, before razing it to the ground. While the Allied force proved very capable at seizing walled cities, holding them was another matter entirely. They simply did not have enough manpower to hold everything that they took. After taking Qingpu, Li Xiuquan sent a large force from Suzhou to hit Songjiang, since the Ava force was absent. Ward turned back to hit Songjiang with his 2,000 Ava troops, leaving 1,500 to garrison Qingpu, which then fell under siege to more Taiping. The garrison of 1,500 men held out for a month, but ultimately they were forced to torch the city and to make their escape. In the summer of 1862, the British and French handed over a group of Taiping prisoners over to the Qing forces, and according to eyewitness accounts, they sat by idly while the Qing performed horrible atrocities. Here is a part of the harrowing account. A young female, apparently about 8 months pregnant, who never uttered a groan or sigh at all the previous cruelties she had endured from the surrounding mob, had her infant cut out of her womb and held up in her sight by one of its little hands, bleeding and quivering. When, at the sight, she gave one heart-rending, piercing screech that would have awakened pity in a tiger, and after it had been in that state dashed upon her breast, she, with a last superhuman effort, released her arms from those holding her down, and clasped her infant to her bleeding heart, and died, holding it there with such a force that could not be separated, and were thus thrown together on the pile of other carcasses. Another young woman among the prisoners awaited her turn to be disemboweled, with a fine boy of 10 months old crowing and jumping in her arms, had him snatched suddenly away from her and flung to the executioner, who plunged a ruthless knife into his tender breast before his mother's very eyes. Infants but recently born were torn from their mothers' breasts and disemboweled before their faces. Young, strong men were disemboweled, mutilated, and the parts cut off thrust into their own mouths, or flung among the admiring and laughing crowds of Chinamen. May God forgive England for the part that she is taking in this war. The foreign press ran rampant stories of horror and brutality, many still trying to stop their nations from taking an active role in China. Others pointed out the savagery to be a justification for colonizing China. Admiral Hope's vision of creating a 30-mile radius around Shanghai proved impossible. The Allied coalition did not have enough men to garrison the places that they took from the rebels, and given the gruesome events at Qingpu and the death of Admiral Protet, Hope was forced to toss in the towel. Soon the forces pulled back to the walls of Shanghai, and Hope was replaced by Rear Admiral Augustus Leopold Cooper. Captain Dew likewise was reprimanded for his part in the escalations to war. Ward could not be reprimanded, of course, but his Ava forces were left to fight on their own, something he did not mind too much, as the British and French forces often stopped his men from plundering. While things were going badly for Shanghai, Zheng Guofan was enjoying an amazing campaign. Dulanga's cavalry were harassing Chen Yucheng in northern Anhui, forcing him to flee to Luzhou. From Luzhou, Chen Yucheng had an extremely bold strategy. He began calling upon Taiping forces and Nian groups to launch a four-pronged campaign going north through Henan and Shaanxi provinces with the ultimate goal of hitting Beijing. 3 of the 4 armies marched north as planned early in 1862, but Chen Yucheng found himself stuck in Luzhou, under siege by the forces of Dulanga and the Xiang army. His communication to the other 3 armies were cut off, and his provisions were dwindling. On May the 13th, he took 4,000 men and broke out of the siege, trying to flee north. But Dulanga's cavalry force gave quick pursuit. Chen Yucheng headed for the city of Suzhou, which one of the army groups had been sent to attack. The army was led by Miao Peilin, someone Chen Yucheng had gotten to defect during the siege of Anqing. Chen Yucheng reached Suzhou before Dulanga's cavalry cut him to pieces, much to his relief. But as he entered the city, Miao Peilin was nowhere to be found. It turns out, because of the severing of communication, Chen Yucheng had no idea that Miao Peilin had been defeated at Suzhou, already back on April the 25th. His entire army had surrendered to the Qing. Miao Peilin had turned back over to the other side. Once a defector, always a defector, as they say. A large reason he was allowed to defect back was because he promised to deliver to the Qing a Taiping general, i.e., Chen Yucheng. Chen Yucheng was quickly taken prisoner, and before he was executed in June of 1862, he had this to say to his captors. "It is heaven's will that has brought me here, and there is nothing that can be said of my past. I have long enjoyed the reputation of a victorious commander, but now I would prefer to look to the future. For the Taiping Heavenly Kingdom to lose me, one single man, it will be as if the mountains and rivers of the kingdom have been reduced by half. I bear a great debt of gratitude to my heavenly dynasty, and I will not surrender. The general of a defeated army cannot beg for his life, but as for the 4,000 men I command, they are veterans of hundreds of battles, and I do not know whether they are still alive. You can cut me to pieces for the crimes I have committed, but this has nothing to do with them." And thus the brave king was dead. The death of Chen Yucheng and the preoccupation of Li Xiucheng with the Shanghai front left Nanjing very vulnerable. The Taiping garrisons along the Yangtze River between Anqing and Nanjing would have no hope for reinforcements from the north nor the east, and Zheng Guochuan was on the march towards the Taiping capital. As Zheng Guochuan advanced, Taiping garrisons simply abandoned their outposts and forts, sending fire to their stockades before they fled. It was an absolute disaster for the Taiping. They had always known the Qing forces would strike Nanjing from Anqing, but they had never expected it to come this soon. By late May, Zheng Guochuan's forces were reaching the Nanjing outskirts. Zheng Guochuan first seized an important junction in the riverway that controlled Nanjing's moat. Then on May the 30th, he attacked a small hill just outside the southern gate of Nanjing. The hill was known as Yuhuatai, Terrace of Flowering Rain, and it held a fort at its very top. While Nanjing had been so heavily fortified, people literally said it was impenetrable after all. It did, however, have vulnerabilities, and Yuhuatai was one of them. The hill was over 300 feet high, around a mile across and about a half a mile away from Nanjing's southern gate. From atop the hill, one could peer right into Nanjing. It was the perfect base of operations for one who wanted to siege such a grand city. Zheng Guochuan had 20,000 men with naval support to provision him. Zheng Guochuan dug in and he began to send word back to his brother asking him for help to procure Western arms. Zheng Guofan was surprisingly not impressed with Western arms at this time. He wrote about how he found them quite finicky, overly complicated, and prone to breaking down after 20 to 30 shots. He wrote back to his brother, "The way to achieve victory is to be found in men, not in arms. Bao Chao had no foreign guns and no foreign powder, yet he repeatedly achieved great victories. He Chen and Zhang Guoliang had foreign cannons with their Green Standard forces during the siege of Nanjing in 1860, but this did not prevent their defeat. A true beauty doesn't fuss over pearls and jade, and a great writer needs no more than a brush and ink. If a general is truly skilled at war, why should he go grasping for foreign weapons? Despite his views on the matter, Zheng Guochuan's persistence, this eventually led him to finally purchase some foreign arms from agents at Canton and Shanghai. Still, Zheng Guofan insisted the foundation of their armies should rely on jinggaos, bird guns, Chinese-made cannons, and the good old sword and spear. One thing Zheng Guofan did realize, though, was the dramatic advantage of steamships. While in Anqing in 1862, he purchased a small steamship from Shanghai and gathered all the Qing scientists and engineers he could to the city to try and reverse engineer it. The ship soon broke down and none were able to repair it. But by the summer, one engineer managed to build a workable prototype steam engine, and a year later, Anqing would create a 28-foot-long steamer. Meanwhile, Prince Gong was also enthralled by the power of the steam engine and was trying to procure the purchase of some ships from Britain. Britain wanted to keep the facade of neutrality going on, especially after the Shanghai embarrassment, and the idea of selling steamships to the Qing was an interesting one. If they provided ships, perhaps Britain's interests in China could be secured simply by protecting the major waterways like the Yangtze River. Prince Gong found an agent to try and get the ships, one Horatio Nelson Lay. Lay went to work approaching Captain Sherard Osborne, the captain of the Furious during the Second Opium War. He offered the captain a 4-year contract, stating the man would take orders only from the Qing Emperor and no other in China. These orders would go first to Lay, who would take up a residence in Beijing. Now, a nitpicky piece of information here. Unlike the Civil War in America, where Britain granted belligerent status to the Confederates, in China no such recognition was ever made. This was because the British Parliament wanted to officially remain neutral. But because there was no official belligerent status for the Taiping, this meant they were not protected by Britain's Foreign Enlistment Act, which prevented the selling of things like gunships to any party that was at war with a nation Britain had friendly relations with, i.e., the Qing. Thus, Britain was free to sell gunships to the Qing to be used against the Taiping. Ironically, at the same time Lay was trying to procure a naval force from Britain, so was James Bullock of the Confederate States of America. Lay would find some success, whereas James would find only failure. Now there were some hiccups for Lay when it came to the Foreign Enlistment Act, however. It was forbidden for British subjects to enlist in the national militaries of a foreign state. Thus, Captain Osborne would require special permission from the Crown. But wouldn't you know it, in August of 1862, the Foreign Enlistment Act was suspended suddenly, and Parliament went into recess over the entire summer and would only reconvene in February. As a Canadian, reading that makes me so angry given the history of Canada for the past 6 or so years and what's been going on with Parliament. Anyways, thus Lay and Osborne was able to serve the Qing, and they were allowed to hire British crews for the ships. 4 months later, Lord Palmerston's government issued a second order making it lawful for any British officer to enlist in the service of the Qing Emperor, to quote, "To serve the said Emperor in any military, warlike or other operations, and for that purpose to go to any place or places beyond the seas, and to accept any commission, warrant, or other appointment from or under the said Emperor, and to accept any money, pay, or reward for their services." There was one twist to all of this. Anyone who served the Qing would have to resign or take a leave of absence from the Royal Navy. And as you can imagine, this meant that anyone who took the job would go unregulated and be unaccountable for their behavior. Basically, they were becoming much like Ward's mercenaries. By the time February came, all the work could not be undone, though the Tories tried to reverse everything, accusing Palmerston and the Whigs for getting Britain directly involved in the Chinese Civil War. The entire thing was lambasted by multiple presses in Britain who pointed out rightfully that Britain's finances were tied to the Qing, paying reparations. And if the Taiping toppled the Qing, well, the money might stop flowing. The first 3 vessels to be sent to China were the Mohawk, the Jasper, and Africa, renamed the Peking, Amoy, and China. The rest of the ships would be freshly constructed, and it would take roughly a year to get them all over. It was to be 7 gunships and 1 store vessel. They would range from men of war to smaller steamers, and they could traverse shallow riverways. They would carry around 40 guns and a crew of 400. Interestingly, the Qing had never before acquired a naval ensign, so they helped invent one, a green and yellow ensign with a dragon in the middle. The ships lacked the latest iron armor, but this was insignificant as the Taiping had no decent artillery to hit them with anyways. The fleet's flagship, the Tiangso, was a 241-footer that could reach 19 knots, a very fast ship for the day. The fleet was called the Anglo-Chinese Expedition, though many historians refer to it as the Ley Osborne Flotilla. Though for the common Chinese people who were witnessing their weak imperial government's willingness to pay foreign mercenaries to win their battles for them, they deemed it the Vampire Fleet. The year of 1863 would prove very fruitful for the Qing Dynasty. I would like to take this time to remind all of you that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Please go subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube and continue to help us produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And hey, don't forget about our sister podcast over at the Pacific War Week by Week podcast, written and narrated by me. And if after all that you are still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel over at YouTube, where I'm just now finishing up a multi-part series on China's warlord era. And just a friendly reminder, I myself have my own Patreon account found at www.patreon.com/thepacificwarchannel, where I am creating exclusive content based off of things you want to hear more about that I can't cover in this podcast and other projects I'm associated with. Also, if you have any critique, please, you can catch me at the Pacific War Discord or the Kings and Generals Discord server, or hell, just leave a comment on any of my YouTube videos. I'm always listening. It seems the rest of the world were now allied against the Taiping. Zheng Guochuan made an extremely bold attack upon Yuhuatai, ushering in the death throes upon the Taiping capital. What more could the Taiping do to stop the inevitable?